4 weeks. That's how long experts gave the world before everything fell apart. Gas prices tripling, planes grounded, whole cities running out of power. It was supposed to be the worst oil disaster in history, and every number backed it up. You could check the math yourself. It was right. Then the deadline came and went, and nothing happened. No blackouts, no empty gas pumps, no planet on fire. It was like watching a hurricane get called off right before it hit land. And here's the strange part. It didn't happen by luck. Somebody made it happen. One country quietly stepped in and stopped the disaster before it could start. And it wasn't the United States. It wasn't Saudi Arabia. It was China, the one country you'd least expect to save its biggest rival. Today, we're going to figure out exactly what China did, how they pulled it off in near total secrecy, and why they might have done it. Because once you see the whole picture, you'll understand why people are calling this one of the strangest power moves in modern history. Section 1. The hole in the world's gas tank. And to get why this is such a big deal, you need to picture the world's oil supply like one giant shared bathtub. Every day, about 100 million barrels of oil get poured into that tub. And every single day, the whole world drains it right back out, using it for cars, planes, factories, and power plants. In goes 100 million. Out goes 100 million. It's always balanced, and there's no extra sitting around as backup. That balance is exactly why a war between Israel and Iran turned into a global panic. When the fighting spilled into the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow strip of water where a fifth of the world's oil ships have to pass through, Iran shut it down. Just like that, 20 million barrels a day stopped flowing. Now, the math breaks. You've got 100 million barrels of demand and only 80 million barrels showing up. That's not a small dent. That's a fifth of the entire world suddenly running dry. Experts said that gap alone was enough to shut down 1 in 5 flights, 1 in 5 factories, and 1 in 5 power plants on Earth. The world did have some backup plans. A couple of pipelines could reroute some oil around the blocked strait, adding back about 7 million barrels a day. Countries also cracked open their emergency oil stockpiles, giant reserves kept in underground tanks and salt caves for exactly this kind of crisis. Over 30 countries opened theirs at once, in the biggest release of emergency oil in history. But even with all that help, the world was still short by about 10 to 12 million barrels every single day. And those emergency stockpiles were draining fast. Japan's reserve was dropping like a rock. America's was heading toward empty too. These backups were built for a short emergency, not a long war. Everyone could see the clock ticking down to disaster. This is the part where you'd expect the story to end badly, and for a while it looked like it would. If you want to see how this story takes a wild turn nobody predicted, stick with me. Because I promise it gets stranger from here. And if you like digging into the hidden stuff behind big world events like this, hit subscribe. This channel breaks down exactly this kind of thing every week. The stuff happening behind the headlines that nobody explains to you in 2 minutes or less. To understand how the world avoided total collapse, we need to follow the trail of one very strange clue that almost nobody noticed at first. Section 2, the buyer who vanished. A few weeks into the war, a group of oil market analysts hopped on a call to walk through what was happening to global supply. And they kept coming back to one chart that made no sense. China's oil imports had dropped by half. Not a small dip, half, overnight. To understand how wild that is, you have to know how much China depends on oil. For decades, China's oil imports have climbed higher and higher year after year as the country built more factories, more cities, and more everything. China buys more oil from the rest of the world than any other country on Earth. Oil is the fuel behind their entire rise as a global power. So when their imports suddenly dropped by 5.5 million barrels a day, right when the war started, it felt impossible. That's more oil than all of India buys in a day. It's more than the 5 biggest economies in Europe buy combined. One country simply stopped buying that much oil, almost overnight, like flipping a switch. And here's the part that made it even stranger. China never said a word about it. No announcement, no press release, no explanation. They just quietly cut their oil habit in half and let the rest of the world figure out why on their own. But that missing oil changed everything. Remember that 10 to 12 million barrel hole we talked about? China's disappearing act shrank that hole down to just 5 million barrels a day. That's still rough. Gas prices still climbed. Some flights still got canceled. But it's the difference between a fender bender and a car crash. Instead of blackouts and factories shutting down across the globe, the world got a few painful months and moved on. China didn't just help. China basically caught the world before it hit the ground. So now the real question isn't what China did. It's how in the world they pulled it off. Because cutting your oil use in half overnight isn't something you can just decide to do on a random Tuesday. It takes planning. A lot of planning. And that's where this story gets really interesting. Section 3. The secret playbook. Since China never explained itself, people had to piece the story together like detectives, using scraps of evidence scattered across news reports, satellite photos, and shipping records. The first clue showed up just 2 weeks into the war. Reports leaked that China had quietly banned its own oil refineries from exporting fuel to other countries. At the time, everyone guessed this was just China stockpiling gas for itself in case of shortages. But looking back, it lines up perfectly with the bigger plan. If China was about to import way less crude oil, its refineries would naturally need to slow down too. That single move alone likely saved around 500,000 barrels a day. The second clue is coal. Just before the war, China had already been building dozens of new coal power plants. Once the war hit, they cranked those plants into overdrive, using coal to cover jobs that oil usually handles, even making things like plastic and fertilizer out of coal instead of petroleum. Not great news for air quality, but another chunk of oil demand disappeared, maybe another 500,000 barrels a day. Third, everyday habits shifted. Chinese airlines canceled a bunch of domestic flights, so more people jumped on trains instead. And here's a fact that mattered more than you'd think. China already had a huge number of electric cars on the road, thanks to years of pushing people to buy them. So when gas prices spiked, millions of people simply weren't affected because their cars didn't run on gas in the first place. That's another slice of the missing oil explained. But even add all of that up, and you're still nowhere close to explaining 5.5 million missing barrels a day. There's one giant piece left, and it might be the biggest secret of all. China has been secretly stockpiling oil for years, hiding it away in massive storage tanks and underground caves. Nobody knows the exact number because China treats it like a state secret. But people have found a clever way to estimate it anyway. Some of China's oil storage tanks have lids that rise and fall depending on how full they are, and those lids are visible from space. Satellite trackers have spent years literally counting these tanks and measuring how full they look, just to guess how much oil China is sitting on. Their best estimate puts China's visible reserves at around 1.5 billion barrels. That's more oil than every other country's emergency reserve combined, all put together. If you tried to picture that much oil in one giant tank, it would be big enough to cover the entire island of Manhattan. And that's just the oil we can actually see. China also stores oil at private refineries and in hidden underground caverns that no satellite can count. With a stash that size, China could burn through 4 million barrels a day from its reserves and still not run dry for over a year. Compare that to other countries. India's backup reserve would only last about 4 days. Europe might squeeze out 2 or 3 weeks. Even the United States, with one of the best emergency reserves in the world, would only last about 2 months. So where did China even get 1.5 billion barrels of secret oil? This is where the story takes another twist, because a lot of it likely came from countries the rest of the world had cut off completely, mainly Iran and Russia. Both countries have had trouble selling oil for years because of bans placed on them by the United States and other nations. Normally, oil gets bought and sold using American dollars, and those trades have to pass through banks connected to the U.S. financial system. That gives America a lot of power, because it can order banks to block deals with countries it doesn't like. But China found a workaround. Instead of paying in dollars, they paid Iran and Russia using their own currency, called the yuan. Since that money never touches an American bank, the U.S. government has no way to see it or stop it. Add in a fleet of ships that quietly turn off their tracking signals, some relabeling of where the oil actually came from, and smaller banks that fly under the radar. And China built a private oil pipeline that almost nobody could trace. And because they were pretty much the only country willing to buy this oil, they likely got it at a steep discount too. Piece all of that together, the refinery ban, the coal, the electric cars, and this enormous hidden stockpile filled with cheap Iranian and Russian oil, and you start to see how China managed something that looked flat out impossible. But knowing how they did it still leaves the biggest question hanging in the air. Why would China spend years secretly preparing for this and then use it to bail out the entire world, including its biggest rival? Section 4. Why would they even do this? The most obvious guess is that China just wanted to protect itself from expensive oil prices. It's a nice, simple explanation. There's just one problem. It doesn't hold up. If China only cared about saving money, they would have started buying oil again once prices dropped low enough to turn a profit. But they didn't. Prices fell well below what China had originally paid for its reserves, and China just kept burning through its stockpile instead of refilling it. That tells us something else was going on. Another guess is that China did this to look good on the world stage, to win friends and build a reputation as a generous global leader. That one falls apart too. If you wanted the world to love you for saving it, you'd probably announce it, maybe even brag about it a little. China did the opposite. They stayed dead silent the entire time. On top of that, banning fuel exports actually hurt neighboring countries in Asia who depend on China for fuel, which isn't exactly how you win hearts and minds. So if it wasn't about saving money or winning praise, what was it really about? A few theories start to make a lot more sense. The first is about Taiwan. China has a long-running fear that in any future conflict, especially one involving Taiwan, the United States could use its navy to block a narrow waterway called the Strait of Malacca, the same way Iran just blocked the Strait of Hormuz, since around 80% of China's oil sails through that exact strait. Losing access to it could bring China's economy to its knees almost instantly. Chinese leaders even have a nickname for this fear. They call it the Malacca Dilemma. By proving they can survive without oil imports for well over a year, China just showed the world, and especially the US, that this old weakness might not scare them anymore. The second theory is about leverage over the United States. Around the middle of the war, President Trump and China's leader held a private meeting. It's easy to imagine China quietly reminding Trump just how much pain they were absorbing on America's behalf by soaking up the oil shock instead of letting it hit the US directly. As long as tensions with Iran stay high, China holds a kind of hidden button. They could resume buying massive amounts of oil at any moment, instantly making the shortage worse for everyone, especially the United States. The third theory is about protecting China's own economy. China builds and sells products to nearly every country on Earth, and a lot of its buyers are nations that would have been crushed by a full-blown oil crisis. If those countries had spiraled into economic trouble, they would have bought a lot less from China, too. By quietly absorbing the shock for 3 months, China may have been protecting its own customers, which means protecting itself. The fourth theory is the boldest one. Some analysts believe China wanted to prove something bigger to the entire world, that it now has the power to control the global price of oil. Back in 1973, a group of Middle Eastern oil producers cut off oil to certain countries, and that single move turned them into major global players for decades afterward. Some experts think China just pulled off a modern version of the same trick, showing that it can turn 5% of global oil demand on or off, almost like flipping a light switch. That kind of power gives you serious influence over pretty much every country that buys or sells oil, which is basically every country on the planet. Nobody can peek inside the mind of China's leadership and know the real answer for certain. But when you look at all 4 of these theories side by side, you start to see a country making one incredibly calculated move for a whole bunch of reasons at once. Section 5, the world just changed. Whatever the exact reason, this single event may have quietly rewritten who really controls the world's oil. For almost 100 years, 3 countries ran the global oil show: the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. America kept the oceans safe for oil ships and controlled the money the world trades oil in. Saudi Arabia led the group of major oil-producing nations. Russia controlled huge oil pipelines running across Europe and Asia. But this war may have cracked that old order wide open. The United States just proved it couldn't fully guarantee the world's oil would keep flowing safely. Russia is still tied up fighting in Ukraine and can barely sell its own oil to anyone. 2 of the 3 old power players just looked a lot weaker. And stepping into that gap, we found 2 new names. Iran proved it could single-handedly shut off 1/5 of the planet's oil supply whenever it wanted, and nobody could stop it. And China proved something arguably even bigger, that it can absorb a global oil disaster almost entirely on its own. And in doing so, it now holds real influence over the price the entire world pays for oil. Nobody knows exactly what China plans to do with that kind of power next. They might not even fully know themselves yet. But one thing feels certain. Now that the whole world has seen what China is capable of, this almost certainly won't be the last time we see them use it. If this blew your mind the way it blew mine, do me a favor and hit like, subscribe, and tap that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. We dig into stories like this every single week, the hidden moves shaping the world that nobody explains to you in a 2-minute headline. So here's my question for you. If China really does hold this kind of power over global oil now, do you think they'll use it to help the world again? Or use it as leverage the next time they want something? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if you liked this, go check out our video on why the US actually struggled to beat Iran in this war in the first place. It connects to everything we just talked about.